Hi there, and welcome back to Epic Mythology. Tonight, we slip out of ordinary time and step into the oldest dark there is. The kind that existed long before books, before screens, before electric light. Just fire, shadow, and a voice that knew how to make the silence lean in. If these journeys mean something to you, please like the video, subscribe. It tells the strange gods of the algorithm that you want more of this. And drop a comment. Which myth from the ancient world has never fully let you go? A love story that still hurts. A battle that still echoes. One quiet, grim episode that simply refuses to leave. Thank you for being here. Wherever you are, whatever hour it is, get comfortable. Close your eyes if you want. Let us begin. Tonight we walk through 7 stories, 7 chambers in the same vast palace of myth. Each one a door. Each one a warning disguised as wonder. We begin with Europa, an Eastern princess whose name will travel westward like a tide, carried on the back of a god who wanted what he saw and simply took it. We follow her brother Cadmus into the founding of a city haunted from its very first stone. We descend with Orpheus into the underworld, where music becomes a weapon against death itself, and where one moment of human weakness costs everything. We ride into the dying fires of Troy, where the Amazon queen and the warrior from the edge of the world arrive like the last bright sparks of a dying blaze. We watch the greatest Greek warrior of them all stand at the center of that storm, unstoppable, until the world demands its price. We watch Ajax, too mighty to bend, shatter under the weight of an insult he cannot survive. We cross into Roman war with Nisus and Euryalus, whose loyalty burns so fiercely the night itself seems to mourn them. And we return to Odysseus, the man of many turns, face to face with the Cyclops in a cave where horror and cunning balance like a blade held steady over open sea. 7 stories, 1 long night. Let's start at the beginning, the myth of Europa and the god disguised as a bull. The sea along the eastern edge of the Mediterranean is not a quiet sea. Even when it lies flat as polished stone, the coast remembers motion. Oars, the creak of hulls, the slow drift of stories from one shore to another, stories that began as whispers and arrived as religion. Long before the Greek poets sharpened these myths into the shapes we know, sailors and merchants were already carrying names and gods like cargo. A princess from the rising sun could become a legend in the West. A gentle animal on a beach could become a divine mask. And a single choice made in laughter, one careless, golden, ordinary laugh, could become the hinge on which an entire world swings. Europa belongs to that older world of crossings. Her home is usually placed in Phoenicia, a word that summons purple dye and cedar wood, harbors thick with trade, and a people whose lifeblood was the sea. The Greeks imagined Phoenicia as glamorous and dangerous, a place of refined craft and foreign splendor. Whether Europa began as a local figure absorbed into Greek myth or was always part of the Greek storytelling imagination, that was never a question the ancient world bothered to ask. Myths were not born with passports. They were adopted, reshaped, and claimed by whoever needed them. She is introduced as a king's daughter. Graceful, bright in the way youth can be bright, not yet aware of how often the gods notice that brightness and mistake it for invitation. Her father Agenor is a king with the settled confidence of a man who believes the world can be organized by command. Her brothers are princes of a proud house. In some traditions, Cadmus walks among them and will soon step into a story of his own. But Europa's tale begins before the roads split. It begins in peace. The beach is wide, the air is warm. The sky above her is the color of a polished gem. She is not alone. She is with companions, girls of the court, attendants who are also friends, sharing the loosened manners of a day without ceremony. Their laughter is ordinary. Their ease is ordinary. That ordinariness is the point. The gods in these stories never intrude on a life already armored. They arrive precisely where innocence is exposed. Zeus sees her. The king of the gods is not a simple figure. He is thunder that protects order, the arbiter of oaths, the father of gods and men. He is also desire made into careless power, a force that considers itself entitled to take whatever catches its eye. The ancient world did not smooth away this contradiction. It placed the contradiction at the center of the divine, as if to say, the forces that govern human life are not neat. They are not moral in the ways mortals wish they were. He does not come to her as a storm. He does not announce himself with lightning, because awe is not what he wants. He chooses cunning, which is a kind of humility that only a ruler can afford. He comes as a bull, not a monstrous bull, not a beast snorting rage and blood, but a creature of impossible gentleness, white as sea foam, calm as an animal that has never known hunger, beautiful in the way that certain dangers always are before they show you what they are. The choice is not random. Across the Mediterranean world, bulls carried the weight of kingship, fertility, and unstoppable force. In Crete, the bull already moved through religious imagery with a gravity that later myths would tie to labyrinths, sacrifice, and the strange collision of human and animal. A god wearing that symbol is not dressing up for fun. It is a declaration, a statement of themes that will echo for centuries. The bull appears among the girls like something conjured from a dream. It lowers its head, almost politely. Its eyes are dark, wide, and patient. It does not charge. It does not threaten. It simply allows itself to be touched. Europa is cautious at first. That is how the story wants to frame her, not as a fool, but as a girl with sense. And the bull is patient with her sense. Patient in the way that great predators can afford to be patient. The girls gather around it. They braid flowers through its horns. They lay their palms along its neck. They speak to it as though it understands not only language, but affection. Perhaps it does. The old poets linger here because this is the moment of seduction that does not look like seduction. Sweetness presented as safety. The god does not need force when he has charm. The more Europa trusts, the more the story tightens its net. At last, she climbs onto the bull's back. She is laughing. She is unafraid. She is delighted by her own boldness. The girls around her cheer. The world does what it always does when youth tests its luck. It nods and lets the wager stand. Then the bull moves. At first it is slow. A gentle turn, a few steps. The girls are still laughing. Then it breaks into a run, not frantic but purposeful. And the sand begins to give way beneath its hooves, and the shoreline begins to dissolve behind her, and water rises around the bull's legs. The laughter stops. This is the instant when myth becomes something else entirely. The border between land and sea is the border between childhood and whatever comes after. She reaches back. She calls out. Her friends stretch toward her. But even kings cannot command a god wearing the shape of a beast. The bull enters the sea as though it belongs there. Waves fold around its shoulders like cloth. The ocean becomes a conspirator. The deep water becomes a road. And Europa's fear is more than physical. She is being taken not only from home, but from identity. A princess without a court is no longer a princess. A girl without her family is no longer protected by the myths that govern ordinary life. The sea crossing turns her into something else, something that now belongs to the geography of legend. They cross to Crete. In the ancient Greek mind, Crete is both real and enchanted. A large island with powerful cities, fertile plains, and a history that archaeology has partly illuminated through the ruins of Minoan palaces, their vivid frescoes, their great bull imagery, their rites that seem to move at the edge of something primal and barely understood. It is tempting to see the Europa myth as a Greek attempt to explain why Crete felt older than Greece itself, why its stories were so saturated with the sacred animal, why its kings seemed to wear the skin of something that preceded them. When they reach the island, Zeus reveals himself. The scene varies by poet and era and audience. Sometimes it is terrible, sometimes strangely tender. The tension in these versions reminds us that ancient myths were living things. They changed with the values of the communities that kept them breathing. Europa becomes the mother of sons who will shape the mythic destiny of Crete. Minos is the most famous. In later stories, he becomes a king of immense authority, associated with law, sea power, and eventually the grim architecture of the Minotaur and the labyrinth. The myth ties the legitimacy of Cretan power to a divine union. A king born from Zeus can claim a sacred inheritance. An island ruled by such a line can claim a destiny larger than its size. The myth does not linger long on Europa's feelings after the crossing. This is one of its crueler silences. The ancient storytellers cared deeply about heroic drama, about divine will, about the machinery of fate, but they rarely granted women the full interior life that later readers ache for. Yet even in the outline of what remains, you can see something remarkable. An Eastern princess pulled into the center of Greek mythic geography, a symbolic mother not only of kings, but of the idea of cultural crossing itself. It is not an accident that her name will be given to an entire continent. The Greeks were fascinated by the line where familiar customs faded into foreign marvels, the point where East became West, where the known world gave way to the edge of the possible. Europa's story is a mythic explanation for that divide and that connection. Her name itself has been read multiple ways. Some Greek writers connected it to a word suggesting broad-faced, while modern scholars have explored possible Semitic roots tied to directions or the setting sun. These etymologies are not conclusive, but they show how myths invite us to read geography as destiny, and names as prophecies written before anyone is born to read them. Her father does not accept the loss quietly. Agenor sends her brothers to find her, with the stern command that feels noble inside a palace and utterly useless against a god. The search becomes a spreading ripple of new myths. This is where Cadmus steps out from the margin of his sister's story and into the center of his own. The structure is elegant. One divine act becomes the seed for multiple journeys. A single abduction becomes the origin of cities and dynasties. When you look at this story through the wider lens of the ancient world, you can feel how it functions as a myth of movement and power. The Phoenicians were famous seafarers. The Greeks knew they had brought writing and luxury goods across the sea. A story that begins with a Phoenician princess carried westward by a divine bull might be cultural memory dressed in sacred clothing. The reality of exchange made into the language of the gods. The bull keeps deepening as the cycle expands. Once Europa arrives in Crete, we move closer to the world of Minos, to the later demand that Athens send its young as tribute for the monstrous child born of divine and animal entanglement, and to the hero Theseus, who will navigate that maze. Europa's myth is not only the story of a girl and a god. It is the opening chapter of a long Cretan saga about authority, sacrifice, and the price of power. There is also a quieter human truth here, the kind that myth tends to hide in plain sight. Europa is young. She is at the age when the world seems safe enough to touch. The bull's gentleness is a test of her instinct, and she passes by every ordinary measure and fails by one extraordinary one. The story is a warning disguised as romance. It tells an audience that the beautiful thing which approaches without threat may still be the beginning of an irreversible change. And yet the myth refuses to be only cautionary. It also offers a kind of terrible awe. The sea crossing is frightening, yes, but it is also grand. It transforms a mortal girl into a cosmic figure. Someone who would otherwise be a footnote in a royal genealogy becomes an immortal name. The ancient world often worked this way, balancing suffering with significance, as if fame were a currency that could purchase meaning even when happiness was denied. By the time the story settles, Crete has gained a queen with an Eastern lineage. The gods have stamped their authority on an island whose myths will dominate imagination for centuries, and the human world has been set in motion. Europa's brothers will scatter, oracles will speak, a dragon will fall, teeth will sprout armed men from the earth, cities will rise from a grief that was never allowed to end properly. So when the story of Europa grows quiet, it feels less like a conclusion than like the closing of a door behind you. You have stepped into a house of myths, where rooms connect to rooms, and one story is always the foundation for the next. The beach where she laughed is gone now, far behind the horizon. The sea has done what it always does in these tales. It has carried a life into legend. Somewhere beyond the Cretan hills, the first lamps of evening were beginning to glow in the courtyards of palaces. And somewhere on the mainland, a brother with a hard heart and tired feet was listening to the words of an oracle, not yet knowing that his sister's loss would become the strange beginning of his own fate. Cadmus and the dragon teeth. Agenor was a king who believed grief could be governed. When Europa vanished from the shore, he did not stand in the doorway of his palace and accept that gods have their own appetites and their own roads across the sea. He did what rulers often do when the universe humiliates them. He turned pain into policy. He summoned his sons, commanded them to bring their sister home, and he spoke with the cold certainty of a man who had never been forced to admit that a throne is not a shield against the sky. So the brothers scattered. In every telling that survives, the search ends the same way. They never find her, but the failure is not the point. The point is what grows from that failure, like a tree from a crack in stone. The myths love these small turns of fate. A missing girl becomes a wandering brother. A wandering brother becomes a founder. A founder becomes a curse threaded into the bones of a city that hasn't been built yet. Cadmus is the one who carries the story forward. He begins as a prince of the East, a man raised in a world of sea trade and royal ceremony, where letters and ledgers and clever hands mattered as much as swords. The Greeks remembered Phoenicia as a place of skill and foreign glamour, and later generations would even connect Cadmus to the arrival of writing in Greece, imagining him as the carrier of the alphabet, a stranger who becomes foundational, a foreigner who plants something that later people will call their own. He journeys westward with his father's command on his shoulders, but the greater weight is quieter, the shame of returning empty-handed. To fail in a king's household is not merely to disappoint a parent, it is to risk erasing your own identity. The road carries him into the Greek world. The oracle appears when a myth needs to pivot. It is the hinge of destiny, the moment a human life is redirected by a voice that sounds like the wisdom of the earth itself. Cadmus goes to Delphi, where Apollo's power is sharp and clean and merciless. The shrine was one of the most famous sacred centers in the ancient Greek imagination, a place where kings and ordinary people alike sought guidance. The historical Delphi was a complex institution: priests, rituals, politics, wealth. The mythic Delphi is simpler. It is the mouth of the world, speaking truth. Cadmus asks about Europa. The god answers with a different question entirely. He is told to abandon the search, to follow a cow marked by a divine sign. When the animal lies down to rest, he must build a city on that ground. You can feel the myth's confidence in this moment. It does not apologize for telling a brother to stop looking for his sister. It treats this redirection as a gift. What looks like a loss of purpose is actually the beginning of something permanent. The new mission will transform helplessness into legend. Cadmus obeys. The cow moves through valleys and across rising country. The landscape shifts. The air changes. The sea is no longer close enough to smell. He is in a more inland world now, the kind where civilizations take root in fields and springs rather than harbors. At last, the animal lies down. The place is Boeotia. The future city is Thebes. Thebes, even the name echoes. It will be the stage for Oedipus and Antigone, for Dionysus and Pentheus, for brother against brother and civil war swallowing a royal house whole. But all of that darkness comes later. In this early moment, Thebes is a promise, a patch of ground chosen by a god, waiting for walls. Cadmus wants to offer sacrifice, gratitude to Athena and Apollo, and whatever powers have guided him here. But first, he needs water. He sends his men to a nearby spring. This is where the story changes texture. A city-founding myth needs blood. It needs a threat that must be overcome before the founder can claim his authority. The spring is guarded by a serpent, or dragon, sacred to Ares. Not merely a large animal. A piece of the war god's ownership, a living extension of divine violence given scales and teeth and centuries of patience. Cadmus waits. His men do not return. He goes to the spring himself and finds the ruin of his company. The dragon rises. The descriptions vary, but the essence is always the same: a vast coiled body, breath that reeks of iron and old water, eyes that seem older than the earth around them. A guardian of a threshold, you want the spring, you pay the price. Cadmus fights. He is not Heracles. He is not a figure of overwhelming mythic strength. He is something else entirely: determination wrapped around intelligence, a hero who must survive with planning as much as courage. That distinction makes his victory feel like a founding act rather than a simple feat of arms. He kills the dragon. The earth accepts the blood. If the story ended there, it would be a standard heroic episode, impressive, unremarkable in the library of Greek myth. But the myth is more imaginative than that. It makes the dragon's body into a seedbed. Athena instructs Cadmus to harvest the creature's teeth and sow them into the ground like grain. This is one of the most unsettling images in all of Greek mythology because it turns war into agriculture. The teeth are ivory blades, each one a promise of violence buried in the earth. Cadmus plants them. The soil trembles, and men rise. Fully armed, born not of mothers but of the earth itself. Warriors without childhood, which is to say, warriors without mercy. The Greeks called them the Spartoi, the sown men. Their armor catches the light. Their eyes are already hardened. And they do what warriors do when no enemy is given to them. They turn on each other. The battle is sudden and total. Newborn soldiers clash in the dust, breaking spears on shields, choking the air with cries that feel older than human language. Cadmus watches. The myth gives him another moment of cleverness. He throws a stone among them. In the confusion, they accuse one another of the insult. The war intensifies. Brother kills brother. The earth that birthed them is quickly fed with their blood. Only a few survive. These survivors pledge themselves to Cadmus. They become the first noble lines of Thebes, ancestral roots of houses that later tragedies will name and curse. You can feel how this functions as an aristocratic origin myth. It grants the elite a lineage that is literally sprung from sacred soil. These are not migrants. These are men with the earth in their bones. Thebes begins to take shape. Walls rise. Temples are planned. Streets grow in the messy, hopeful way that early cities grow. But the gods do not let Cadmus have this victory without a reckoning. The dragon was sacred to Ares. Killing it is both a heroic necessity and a religious crime. The Greek imagination loved this paradox, the idea that the act required to build civilization might still offend the forces that govern the wild. In some versions, Cadmus must serve Ares for years as penance. A city can be founded on violence, but the founder must still settle his accounts. Then comes Harmonia. She is said to be the daughter of Ares and Aphrodite, which is a perfect mythic pairing. The child of war and love, the living symbol of the balance between conflict and attraction that prevents human societies from tearing themselves entirely apart. Cadmus marries her. The wedding is one of those luminous interludes the myths use to briefly soften the world. The gods attend. Gifts are given, a moment of grace in a story built from blood and earth. Some traditions place the famous necklace of Harmonia here, a beautiful object carrying a curse that will tighten around future generations like a hand slowly closing. The Greeks loved these cursed heirlooms, reminders that the past can sit quietly at your throat and wait. But for a moment, the story lets Cadmus simply be happy. His city stands. His marriage binds him to the divine. His name will endure. And yet Thebes is a city whose myths carry a strange, persistent gloom. The house of Cadmus will be tested again and again. His descendants will suffer as if the dragon's blood never truly left the soil, as if the earth never fully forgave the violence used to claim its spring. When you step back from the narrative, you see how many themes are concentrated here. The foreign founder, the outsider who arrives with an oracle's blessing. Many Greek cities share this kind of legend, stories that explain identity by tracing it to someone who was both chosen and displaced. In Cadmus, this becomes particularly potent because he is connected to an Eastern world that the Greeks both admired and feared. There is the tension between Ares and Athena, chaotic violence against purposeful, civic violence. A city must be defended. A king must be capable of war. But the myth insists there is a price when war is honored without restraint. And there are the Spartoi themselves, a statement about the nature of elite power. To claim your noble ancestors sprang from sacred earth is to claim inevitability. It makes your status feel natural rather than political. But modern readers can feel the other current running beneath this image too. Who belongs to this land? Who has the right to rule it? What violence was required to turn contested ground into a city? Myth often compresses centuries of anxiety into a single scene. Cadmus is also a bridge between Europa's story and the later saga of Thebes. He is the brother who could not bring her home. In a way, he transforms that helpless grief into architecture. He cannot reverse the divine act that stole his sister, but he can build something permanent from the ruins of that command. The myth is cruel in this way, yet it grants him the dignity of a new destiny. As the years pass in the story's shadowed background, Thebes grows into a name that commands reverence and dread. Cadmus ages. In some versions, his end is quiet and strange. He and Harmonia leave Thebes after the tragedies of their family become unbearable, journeying to a distant land. There, in a final metamorphosis that feels like mythic punctuation, they are transformed into serpents. The founder, who killed a dragon, becomes a dragon himself. The cycle closes, not with moral clarity, but with symbolic symmetry. It is a haunting ending. Perhaps the ancient storytellers were suggesting that the line between hero and monster is thinner than we like to believe. Or that founding a city means binding your soul to the deep forces of the land so completely that you eventually take on the shape of what you once fought. Or perhaps the transformation is simply the myth's way of honoring the ancient holiness of serpents, creatures who embodied both danger and renewal, death and rebirth, guardianship and curse all at once. However you read it, Cadmus's tale is not a simple story of triumph. It is a story of building a future while carrying the permanent ache of what could not be saved. A story that validated both pride and fear in equal measure. Thebes could claim a founder chosen by an oracle, aided by Athena, honored by the gods. But Thebes also carried the shadow of Ares's anger and the memory of blood-soaked beginnings, and no amount of ceremony could wash that out of the stones. After the founding of cities and the sowing of dragon teeth, after the hard clang of origin stories that smell of bronze and fresh-cut stone, the old world turns its face toward something more delicate and more dangerous. It turns toward the inner life. The Greeks knew that a kingdom might be built with walls and spears, but they also knew that a person could be undone by grief in a single afternoon, and that the most stubborn fortress in the world was the human heart when it refused consolation. This is where Orpheus enters the lineage of myth. Not as a conqueror, as a man whose power lives in breath and string and the space between notes. He belongs to Thrace in many tellings, a land the Greeks imagined as wild, at the edges of their civilized world, a place of cold rivers and mountain winds and older rites. And yet his gift is not savage. It is almost too refined for the mortal world. He is said to be the son of Calliope, the muse of epic song, and sometimes of Apollo himself, which is the mythic way of explaining a talent so unnatural that ordinary parentage feels insufficient. He is the kind of figure who makes the boundary between art and magic blur until it disappears. Animals go quiet when he plays. Trees lean toward the sound. Stones seem to shift, as if creation itself wants to be closer to a melody that speaks its secret name. In a culture where poetry and song were not ornaments but carriers of memory, law, and prayer, the idea of a musician who could alter the behavior of the world was not beautiful fantasy. It was a plausible dream, the kind you halfway remember believing. Eurydice comes into his life like sunlight on water. The Thales do not always linger on her, because this is one of those myths where a woman is introduced through the love she inspires and the loss she will embody. But the love itself is not treated as trivial. Their marriage is a brief season of harmony in a mythic tradition that distrusts happiness the way a seasoned traveler distrusts a calm road. You can imagine the wedding in a valley rimmed with green, the smell of crushed flowers, friends and family who believe they are watching a beginning, not an ending already written. Orpheus plays for her the way a man speaks his soul aloud. Then the myth folds in the cruelty that makes it unforgettable. Eurydice is walking with companions when she is pursued. She flees. Her foot finds the hidden danger in the grass. A serpent strikes. The venom moves swiftly. The story does not describe every detail of her death because the emotional fact is enough. One moment she is part of the living world. The next she is gone. And a man who believed his music could hold joy in place discovers that joy has no obligation to remain. Orpheus breaks in a way that is both deeply human and mythically extraordinary. Grief in the ancient world was expressed through ritual, through public mourning, through the prescribed shapes of loss. But Orpheus is not an ordinary mourner. He does not accept the boundary between life and death as a law that cannot be tested. This refusal is what makes him a different kind of hero. Where others reach for swords, he reaches for his lyre. His decision to descend alive into the realm of the dead is a shock, even within a tradition full of impossible journeys. It is a belief made visible that art is not merely decorative, that music is not entertainment, that it is a force capable of bargaining with the deepest cosmic order. He travels to the places where the earth begins to feel like a doorway rather than a foundation, a cave mouth, a sacred fissure, and as he steps down, the temperature changes. The air thickens. The story itself grows quieter, as though it is respecting the gravity of what he is attempting. The underworld in Greek thought is not hell in any later moral sense. It is a kingdom of inevitability, ruled by Hades and Persephone, structured by rivers that map the human condition as much as any physical landscape. The Styx, the river of oaths. Lethe, the water of forgetting. The Acheron, associated with sorrow. These are not just geography, they are psychology. And into this place, Orpheus walks, playing. The guards at the gates of the dead stop, the shades hovering in their gray existence pause. Cerberus goes still. Even the torments of the underworld slow their eternal machinery. Tantalus forgets his hunger for a moment. Sisyphus sits down on his boulder and simply listens. Hades himself, who has no softness for the living, feels something that a god of death has no word for. He grants the request. Eurydice may return with Orpheus to the living world, under one condition. He must walk ahead of her. He must not look back, not until they have both crossed into the light. One condition, an instruction of almost insulting simplicity. They walk. The path rises through stone and shadow. Somewhere behind him he can hear, or thinks he can hear, the soft sound of her footsteps. Or does he hear them? The silence presses in. His mind, the mind of a man who has already lost everything once, begins to whisper its questions. What if she is not there? What if the god has deceived him? What if he is walking alone through the dark and she was never following at all? The human imagination is its own enemy. And doubt, that particular, specific shade of doubt that visits people exactly when they can least afford it, is the cruelest thing the gods ever put inside us. He turns. She is there. But the moment his eyes find her, the bargain breaks. She is pulled back, not violently, not with cruelty, but with the terrible gentleness of inevitability. She has time only to say his name, or perhaps not even that. She is gone. He cannot follow. The gates close behind him. His music, which moved the stones and stilled the rivers of the dead, cannot open them again. The gates do not open twice for the same plea. He returns to the upper world with a grief now doubled by guilt. He did not merely lose Eurydice. He lost her by failing a test that the gods designed to expose a human weakness they already understood perfectly. If earlier myths show the gods tricking or overwhelming mortals, this one shows something stranger. A god offering a path almost merciful in its simplicity, and then allowing human nature to ruin it. The story becomes an anatomy of regret. Orpheus withdraws from ordinary life. His music changes, still powerful, perhaps more powerful than before, but carrying now a shadow that even the birds and trees can feel. In the ancient world, music was associated with cosmic order, with the tuning of the soul to harmony. Orpheus's sorrow suggests that even perfect harmony can be wounded, that the most beautiful instrument can be used to play a broken song. His end is as violent as his love was tender. The women of Thrace, often identified with the frenzied worshippers of Dionysus, turn on him. The reasons vary by telling. He has rejected them, turned away from their rites, set his devotion elsewhere in the way of a man who has decided that one love is worth more than all others. The mythic logic is darker. A man who entered the underworld and returned is no longer entirely safe among the living. He has crossed a boundary that ordinary society cannot tolerate. He exists at the wrong frequency. The women tear him apart. It is savage. It is ritualistic. It echoes the ancient understanding that ecstatic religion can be both sacred and terrifying, that the divine and the dangerous are never fully separate. His head and lyre are cast into a river. The current carries them toward the sea. And the head, the ancient poets claim this with the straight face of people who have never doubted it. The head continues to sing. The instrument continues to sound. This is one of the most striking claims in all of Greek myth. The idea that art is so bound to identity that it can outlast the body. That a song can survive even when the singer has been silenced by human hands. Later tradition makes Orpheus into a figure linked to secret teachings about the soul, to mystery cults that believed death was not the final word, that purification was possible, that the journey beyond the grave could be navigated by those who carried the right knowledge. Gold tablets found in ancient graves, inscribed with guidance for the dead, reflect a world where people sought personal assurances about what awaited them on the other side. Whether Orpheus was the origin of these beliefs, or simply the mythic emblem adopted by later spiritual movements, his story fit the hunger that drove them. If a man could nearly retrieve his wife from death, perhaps death was negotiable in ways that official religion preferred not to examine. Or perhaps the myth is saying something simpler and more permanent, that the only true rescue from oblivion is remembrance, that we survive in the songs others sing of us. The story endures because it refuses to be only one thing. It is a love story, but not a comforting one. It is a story about art so powerful it can still the machinery of death, but not powerful enough to heal one human impulse toward doubt. It honors perseverance while admitting that perseverance can crack at the final step. It is, above all, a story about the cost of looking back, about how memory can be both sanctuary and trap, how there are moments when the past cannot be retrieved without destroying the present. The lesson is not preached. It is lived in the ache of the narrative. When the night settles over the hills of Thrace again, the world above ground has resumed its ordinary rhythms. Even as Orpheus's music lingers in the air like the aftertaste of honey and smoke, shepherds gather their flocks. Wind moves through leaves with the faint sound of strings. A small household lamp is lit against the dark. A lover pauses, perhaps, thinking of the thin line between trust and fear, between patience and the single moment of panic that changes everything. The river carries Orpheus's singing head onward, indifferent and faithful to its course, as if reminding the living that nature does not mourn the way people do, yet still carries their stories to distant shores. The battles with the Amazon and Memnon. The Trojan War has a way of swallowing time. By the point where our story turns back to its smoky shore, the war is no longer a clean contest between proud peoples fighting for principle or pride. It is a long season of grief that has hardened into routine. Men wake to the same wind off the Hellespont. They eat the same rationed bread. They walk past the same beached ships, as if passing the exposed ribs of some enormous animal that died long ago, and no one has moved. The songs that once promised swift glory have grown rough with repetition. The kings are older in the face. The soldiers are thinner in hope. The Trojan plain has been trampled so many times that the earth itself must be exhausted. This is the late war. The war after the brave speeches have expired, when simple endurance becomes a kind of courage, not the bright kind, but the gray kind that keeps armies from dissolving. The Iliad gives us the heart of this conflict, but myth never lets the war end there. The later tradition, the lost epics of the cycle, and the poets who quarried their brilliance, introduces new arrivals like the story itself has decided to refuse death. One last fierce breath for Troy. One last taste of genuine dread for the Greeks. It brings on the Amazon queen, then Memnon, and it throws Achilles into the center of these final storms like a blade that has not yet learned how to dull. Achilles at this stage is both man and omen. The Greeks think of him as their sharpest weapon, but they also fear the scale of his wrath, because he is the kind of warrior who can save an army and in the same hour shame it. His mother is Thetis, a sea goddess who tried every trick of divinity to prevent his mortality from swallowing him. Every version of his childhood carries the same anxious truth. He is destined for greatness that ends early. He knows it in his bones, even when he doesn't say it aloud. The mythic imagination treats him like a candle made of rare wax, brilliant, and doomed to burn too fast. After Hector's death, after the great griefs and triumphs that followed Patroclus, Achilles stands in a strange balance between exhaustion and invincibility. The Trojans recoil at the mention of his name. The Greeks exhale when they see him stride onto the field. He is the war's sharpest fact and its most dangerous myth. Then Penthesilea comes. The Amazon have always lived in the Greek imagination as a frontier of possibility and fear. Women who fight like men, who live by laws that seem to deny the domestic order the Greeks considered natural. Whether the Amazon myth echoes real memories of steppe warrior cultures or is primarily a symbolic invention, the stories treat them as formidable enough to be genuinely terrifying. Skilled horsewomen, archers with deadly patience, disciplined formations that move across open ground like weather. In art and poetry, they are exotic, noble, and always doomed. The perfect adversary for a hero who must prove not only strength but the rightness of his world. To fight an Amazon is to fight a mirror that refuses to flatter you. Penthesilea is called queen. Some traditions say she comes to Troy carrying an inner wound, a guilt that drives her there as much as any alliance. She has killed her sister. By accident, in a hunting frenzy, in a battlefield confusion that no one forgave, and she least of all. The stain of that moment follows her like smoke. The myth shapes her as a tragic figure rather than a simple invader. She is not merely brave. She is seeking redemption through danger, which is a very Greek idea of purification. She arrives at the gates of Troy with her warriors and their gleaming gear. And for a city that has watched hope bleed out year after year, her presence is like sudden sunrise after a very long night. The Trojans have lost too many champions. Their allies have thinned. Their walls still stand, but morale is a more fragile rampart than stone. The Amazon, riding in from the edge of the world, bring the thrilling illusion that fate might still be persuaded. The first clashes are fierce and swift. The Amazon do not fight like desperate defenders. They fight like an army that chose this war, which makes them far more dangerous than men simply trying to survive. Greek lines tighten. Trojan spirits lift. The plain that has heard so many male legends now shakes with the thunder of hooves and the sharp singing of women trained to treat fear as a small thing. The poets who preserved this story loved the contrast. Achilles is the greatest of Greek men, the archetype of heroic violence. Penthesilea is the greatest of Amazon warriors, the archetype of heroic defiance. Their meeting is inevitable in the way mythic meetings always are, as if the story itself demands that two symbols collide to settle which world is allowed to endure. When they finally face each other, the fight is described with the grandeur of men who understood they were writing the last bright chapter of Troy's defense. Penthesilea is swift and fearless, not reckless, but intensely, terrifyingly alive in the way a doomed champion often is. Achilles is a storm that has learned to take human shape. Spears flash, shields ring. The surrounding soldiers fall back, because even in a war that has seen gods descend into the melee, there are moments when everyone understands they are watching something larger than strategy. Achilles kills her. And then comes the unsettling moment that has haunted this myth for centuries. He looks at her face. The rage of combat drains away. What remains is something softer and stranger. Some poets say he feels love or something indistinguishable from it. Others say pity or awe. But the emotional truth runs through every version. He recognizes her beauty and her courage too late. He sees what he has destroyed only in the moment of its destruction. It is a reminder that even the greatest warrior can be ambushed by the quiet power of what he has already ended. The Amazon are defeated, but the war does not pause to honor them. It consumes their story and immediately hungers for the next one. The next champion is Memnon. He enters the tradition with an aura of vast distance. He is king of the Ethiopians in many sources, though the ancient Greek use of that term often referred broadly to peoples from the far south or east, beyond the edges of the familiar world. The point is not geography. The point is wonder. Memnon's army is dark-armored and magnificent, another reminder that Troy's struggle has become global in mythic terms, drawing warriors from lands that most Greeks would never see. He is the son of Eos, the dawn goddess, and that divine parentage imbues him with a particular luminous sadness. Dawn comes every day, beautiful, brief, a spectacle that fades into ordinary light before it can be held. To be the child of dawn is to carry the symbolism of glory that cannot last. Memnon arrives after Penthesilea's fall, when the Trojans have already tasted the cruelty of hope restored and removed. His presence renews that cycle. He is described as a warrior of exceptional stature, commanding, skilled, someone who can step into the gap left by Hector's death and make the Greeks doubt the outcome again. His forces hit hard. Fresh strength from a distant kingdom cuts through an army that thought it understood the season. Memnon himself, in many versions, kills Antilochus, the young son of Nestor, a man associated with loyalty and promise. The death is not merely another casualty. It is personal. It wounds the Greeks in the intimate way the war still has the power to wound them. Achilles is drawn toward Memnon, as a blade finds a whetstone. The poets frame their duel as a meeting of semi-divine destinies. Both men have divine mothers. Both are celebrated as the finest of their peoples. Both are fated to die young. Olympus itself grows quiet to watch two bright lives burn their last fierce flame. Eos prays for her son. Thetis prays for hers. Zeus, in some versions, weighs their fates on a scale, an image that appears elsewhere in Greek tradition, a reminder that even the greatest powers acknowledge structures of destiny that cannot be permanently bribed. The duel is evenly matched, which is crucial. Memnon cannot be a stepping stone for Achilles. He must feel like a real threat, a warrior who might plausibly end the greatest Greek story on his own terms. When Achilles finally kills him, it is not presented as effortless. It is a costly superiority, the kind that leaves both victor and witness shaken by how close the world came to a different ending. Eos's grief is one of the most beautiful sorrow motifs in all of the Trojan tradition. The dawn goddess mourning her son becomes a cosmic explanation for the tears of morning light, the dew that appears each day on the grass, the faint glow that arrives before the sun, carrying something that looks like loss. Some later stories speak of birds called the Memnonides that honor him in ritual combat, or of a statue that sings at sunrise. The old instinct, to connect the rhythms of nature to the rhythms of grief. The world remembers. The world is not indifferent. With Memnon dead, Achilles stands again as the war's unavoidable center. But this sequence of victories carries its own dark shadow. Every triumph sharpens him further and draws him closer to the edge of his own fate. The ancient audience already knew that Achilles does not survive the war, even though the Iliad ends before that moment. The later tradition is heavy with foreknowledge. When Achilles defeats the Amazon queen and then the dawn goddess's son, he has essentially exhausted the last great adversaries the story can offer him. The next opponent is no longer a heroic champion. It is fate itself. The death of Achilles is told different ways, but the pattern never changes. Paris, with Apollo's guidance, strikes him with an arrow. The wound in the heel is the tradition most remembered, though early sources are less explicit about a single vulnerable point. What matters, in mythic terms, is the idea that a nearly invincible warrior is undone not by a stronger man, but by a precise strike guided by divine will. You cannot wrestle an arrow. You cannot argue with it. It arrives. Achilles is fighting as he always fights, with speed and fury that makes ordinary warriors look like slow-moving shadows. He is not thinking about the quiet prophecies that have followed him since childhood. He is thinking about the present moment of war, which for him has always been the only moment that truly mattered. Then the arrow finds him. The shock is not only physical, it is narrative. The Greeks respond with the desperate ferocity that appears whenever a legend is threatened with erasure. They fight to recover his body. Ajax the Great and Odysseus are often named in this struggle, and in that detail lives a subtle foreshadowing of the grim contest that is about to come over Achilles' armor. Recovering the body is not only comradeship, it is cultural preservation. A hero's body in Greek thought is not merely flesh. It is the locus of honor. To lose it would be to allow the meaning of his life to be rewritten by those who hated him. The mourning is immense. Thetis rises from the sea with her sisters, a wave of divine sorrow crashing onto human ground. The funeral games, the laments, the rituals, these are the machinery that turns death into immortal memory. Achilles has achieved the bargain that haunted him from childhood, the short life with undying fame. The ancient listeners would have recognized both the grandeur and the tragedy of that exchange. Glory is expensive. It costs time, tenderness, and the chance to grow old into quieter forms of happiness. With Achilles gone, the war begins to devour its own foundations. He was not only a champion, he was the symbol of Greek inevitability. If he can fall, then the war itself is approaching the moment where victory is no longer about who is strongest. It is about who still has the will to endure the last ugly miles. As evening descends over the Greek camp, men speak of Achilles in the past tense for the first time. And that alone, just the grammar of it, is a wound deeper than any spear. The armor that once seemed like a second skin for something almost immortal now lies quiet, waiting for the next argument among the living. The Trojans behind their walls allow themselves a fragile exhale, not because they believe the war is won, because the monster of Greek inevitability has finally bled. The plain receives another name. The night wind passes over it like a soft hand that does not distinguish between victor and defeated. The death of Ajax. After Achilles died, the war did not end. It only changed its voice. The Greeks had lived for years with the sound of his name like a blade drawn in the dark. You could feel how much of their confidence had been built around him, how many plans and prayers had assumed he would simply always be there to turn the tide. When his body was carried back through the dust and the shouting, when the men saw the blood on the armor and the stillness of a face that had never looked truly afraid, something in the camp tightened and went quiet. The sea kept breathing against the shore. The ships stayed pulled up in their long line like tired horses. The kings moved with the same authority they had always worn, but even authority has moments when it feels like a costume. Grief was not new to these men. The Trojan plain had been feeding on grief for a decade, but this grief was larger. It was grief for an entire era of the war. Achilles had been a guarantee. Now the Greeks had to remember what it felt like to fight without certainty. The funeral rites were immense, not only because he had been loved, but because he had to be made into something that could outlast the shock of his absence. A generation of warriors needed to see that even the most brilliant life could be shaped into glory after death, because otherwise fear would eat them alive before the next battle began. When the smoke thinned and the rituals approached their end, the question of Achilles' armor rose like a new fire. It was not a simple matter of inheritance. Armor in the epic tradition is identity made metal. It carries memory, status, and the story of a man who stood in the center of danger and survived. The armor of Achilles had been forged by divine hands in the mythic telling, a gift of artistry and protection that felt almost too luminous for ordinary men. Whoever claimed it next would not only gain protection, he would gain a claim to being the greatest of the remaining Greeks. Two names stood above the rest, two visions of what a hero should be. Ajax the Great was the obvious candidate by the measure of raw heroism. He was enormous, the kind of man the poems describe as a tower in motion. His shield was famed for its size, his strength for its blunt, unhesitating inevitability. He had been the bulwark who held the Greek line when panic threatened to spread. He rarely spoke in elaborate rhetoric. He acted. He stood. He fought. He was the sort of warrior whose honor was simple enough to be sacred. Odysseus was everything Ajax was not. Not small, but not a giant. His power lived in the mind, in the ability to see an angle where another man saw a wall. He could speak with the persuasive calm of a man who knows how to build a bridge between a crowd and an idea. He had been essential in councils, in plans, in moments when intelligence mattered more than force. The war itself had already begun to tilt toward strategies that required cunning as much as swords. The contest for the armor, became a contest between two civilizations' ideas about what excellence actually means. Ancient sources differ on how the decision was made. Trojan captives judged it in some versions. Greek leaders debated it in others. Some suggest the choice was made in backrooms, in the calculations of power rather than the clear light of merit. The facts matter less than the emotional truth the myth preserves. Ajax expected the armor not because he was greedy, but because he believed the world still operated by a clear, legible code. He had carried Achilles' body from the battlefield. He had served as the wall while others maneuvered behind him. To a man like Ajax, the armor did not feel like a prize to win. It felt like the natural continuation of who he already was. When the judges awarded the armor to Odysseus, the insult landed like a spear that cannot be removed. Ajax does not explode at once. He is not a man of theatrical fury. His rage sinks inward. It becomes the kind of anger that burns behind the eyes while the face remains still. The Greeks around him might have mistaken this silence for acceptance, because war teaches men to hide pain until pain becomes part of their posture. But shame is different from pain. Shame is more intimate. It dissolves a man from the inside. Especially a man who has built his entire identity on an honor that is visible, agreed upon, publicly recognized. This is where the tragedy begins to feel like more than an individual breakdown. It becomes a cultural anxiety expressed through a single man. The Greeks loved cunning and admired it, but they also feared the possibility that clever speech could eclipse honest strength, that the rules of excellence were being quietly rewritten in the dark. Ajax becomes the embodiment of that fear, the brave man who cannot navigate the new world. Athena enters this part of the story, and her involvement matters, because it shifts Ajax's suffering from ordinary resentment to tragic inevitability. In the mythic logic, gods don't merely observe. They adjust the moral temperature of a situation. Ajax had not necessarily offended her in any crude way, but he was a man who could feel too self-sufficient, too reliant on strength that left insufficient room for humility before the divine order. And the ancient poets returned again and again to this tension. A hero who believes himself complete invites the gods to demonstrate that no human is. Athena strikes Ajax with madness. Madness in Greek myth is not random illness. It is punishment, test, or terrible correction. Ajax in his frenzy believes he is taking revenge on the men who shamed him. He imagines he is cutting down Agamemnon and Menelaus and perhaps Odysseus himself. The darkness of night becomes a cloak for this false reality. But the victims of his rage are not kings. They are livestock. Sheep and cattle bellow in the dark. The great warrior whose hands have carried spears against Trojan champions now slaughters animals as if they were his enemies. There is something both horrifying and unbearably sad in this image. The myth is not mocking Ajax. It is showing what it looks like when a man's identity fractures completely under the pressure of humiliation. When he regains his senses, the slaughtered animals lie around him like evidence at a trial. The camp knows, his enemies know, his allies know. In a warrior culture, reputation is armor as real as bronze. Ajax's reputation has been stripped from him in a single night. The fact that the gods caused the madness offers no relief, because the world of myth rarely lets a hero evade consequences by pointing at the divine. That would weaken the tragedy. Instead, Ajax is forced to live inside the humiliation of something he could not control. And what remains to him is the one choice he still believes he can make with his own hands. He chooses death. This is not impulse. It is the last act of a man trying to reclaim agency in a story that has stripped him of it. The ancient world understood this logic. Without honor, Ajax cannot recognize himself in the mirror. The world may still need his strength, but he no longer believes that need can heal the wound of ridicule. He seeks a secluded place. He speaks to the gods with a mixture of bitterness and terrible acceptance. He plants his sword in the earth. In some traditions, the sword was a gift from Hector, which adds a cruel symmetry. A Trojan weapon becomes the instrument of a Greek hero's end, as if the war itself is closing a circle around him. Ajax falls upon it. The earth takes him. The moment is stark. There is no glorious duel, no flurry of spears and crowd. This is a death without spectacle, which is precisely what makes it resonate. A great warrior is undone not by an enemy's strength, but by a wound to the soul that cannot be sutured. The aftermath becomes another battlefield, fought with words and dignity rather than blades. The Greeks argue over whether Ajax deserves burial, a perfect continuation of the theme that has haunted him. His worth is being measured again, debated again, subjected to the judgments of men who did not carry the same weight of shame. In some traditions, Odysseus himself argues that Ajax should be honored in death despite their rivalry, which adds an unexpected note of nobility to the more complex hero. The myth doesn't want Odysseus to be merely the man who benefited from Ajax's humiliation. It wants him to be capable of recognizing greatness, even when it is inconvenient. This complexity is part of why Ajax survived so powerfully into Greek tragedy. Sophocles' play explores his fall with psychological depth that must have struck ancient audiences hard, because it invited them to sympathize with a man who is both deeply admirable and dangerously rigid. Democratic Athens still revered the older aristocratic code of heroic honor, but also required a different kind of civic flexibility. Ajax, in that context, becomes more than a mythic figure. He becomes a question asked of the audience directly. What happens to a society when its strongest defenders cannot adapt to the new terms of prestige? Even in the epic context, Ajax's death marks a turning point. The Greeks are now a camp of diminished giants. Achilles is gone. Ajax is gone. The war will still be won, but victory will arrive through cunning more than force. Through Odysseus. Through the wooden horse and night raids and the moral compromises of a conflict that has long since outgrown its original clarity. Ajax would not have survived in that world. He was built for a different kind of war. And yet the myth does not discard him as obsolete. It treats him as necessary. Every culture that tells stories about war needs a figure like Ajax. He is the stone in the river that proves the current is strong. He is the reminder that courage can be both magnificent and fragile, specifically, when it depends on public recognition to hold its shape. As the Greek camp settles into uneasy silence after his death, soldiers speak of Ajax in low voices. The way men speak of someone too great to be reduced to rumor. They remember his shield, his presence in the worst hours, the way you could stand behind him and believe the line would hold. They also remember the sound of livestock, dying in the dark under a sword meant for kings. Both images live inside the mind of the camp. And the tension between them, between honor and humiliation, between what Ajax was and what he became in that single terrible night, is his true ghost. It will haunt the war even after Troy falls. The armor of Achilles, newly claimed and contested in memory, seems to gleam in the lamplight with a cold kind of prophecy. The age of raw giants is ending. The age of clever survivors is about to begin. Nisus and Euryalus. The Trojan War ended in fire and deception, but the world that survived it did not find peace in the ash. The old stories have a way of insisting that victory is only a doorway, that the fall of a city is not the end of a people, only the beginning of a longer, harder chapter. When Virgil wrote of Aeneas and the wanderers of Troy, he was not simply retelling a tale of escape. He was constructing a mythic spine for Rome itself, tying the empire of his own age to the ruined towers of the ancient East, asking his audience to see their power not as accident, but as destiny tempered by loss, shaped by grief, and paid for in blood they were still paying centuries later. Within that grand architecture, the story of Nisus and Euryalus rises like a smaller tower inside a larger city, intimate and brutal, a chapter of friendship lit by the cold light of war. The Aeneid is full of kings and prophecies and the heavy machinery of fate. But in this night raid, the poem slows down. It breathes close to two mortal hearts, as if to remind everyone listening that empires are not built only by founders and gods, but by young men who believe that loyalty is worth more than life, and who never quite get the chance to learn whether they were right. The war in Italy has already begun to echo the war at Troy in shape and sorrow. Aeneas has landed among unfamiliar rivers and forests, carrying the burden of his household gods and the memory of a city that exists now only in songs and nightmares. The Latins are not simple villains. Turnus is not a monster. He is a local champion who believes a foreign fleet has come to steal what was promised to him: a bride, a kingdom, a future as legitimate as dawn. The tensions between the old world and the new arrivals are not framed as righteousness against wickedness. They are framed as collision. This is partly why the Aeneid feels so modern in its emotional logic. It understands that history is rarely one side being right and the other being wrong. More often, it is two rights that cannot fit inside the same narrow world. When Aeneas leaves the camp to seek allies, the Trojans are left behind their hastily built defenses, threatened by Turnus and the Rutulians, an enemy force hungry to crush the newcomers before their roots can settle. The Trojan camp becomes a smaller echo of besieged Troy itself, but with one crucial difference. In this new war, the Trojans are not defending the city of their birth. They are defending the fragile possibility of their future. Nisus and Euryalus belong to that tense interim, the moment when a people is suspended between what they lost and what they have not yet earned. Nisus is older, experienced, gifted in speed and stealth, a man who has already learned that survival in war depends on more than courage. Euryalus is younger, striking, luminous with the kind of beauty that poets notice specifically because they know what they are about to do to him. Virgil introduces their bond with unusual tenderness. He does not treat them as incidental soldiers. He pauses to frame their friendship as something exemplary, a model of devotion that should make the audience feel both admiration and dread simultaneously. The Roman world valued loyalty between comrades in arms. The Aeneid, written in the age of Augustus, is saturated with ideals of duty, endurance, and individual sacrifice for the community's future. Yet this episode pulses with personal affection that feels almost too warm for the harsh logic of epic poetry. Virgil allows the relationship to be intense and exclusive, a private flame inside a public war. He knows exactly what he is doing when he sets that flame against the wet darkness of a dangerous night. The Rutulians press the siege hard, but night eventually arrives, and with night comes fatigue, the soft armor of exhaustion that can seduce even disciplined armies into carelessness. The enemy camp sprawls across the plain with a confidence that is almost reckless. Fires burn low, wine is shared, victory feels certain. In this relaxed disorder, Nisus sees an opening. He proposes a mission that is both practical and heroic. Someone must break through the enemy lines and reach Aeneas with news of the siege and a plea for swift return. The plan is difficult but not impossible. The greater risk, the risk the story knows is already waiting, is that what begins as a messenger's duty can easily blur into the temptation of a raid. Because war offers the hungry heart too many chances for sudden glory. Euryalus insists on joining him. The older warrior resists at first, not from doubt about Euryalus' courage, but from a protective love that Virgil treats as entirely noble. Euryalus is fierce in his insistence. He wants a share of danger and honor. He wants to prove that his loyalty is not ornamental. He is also the kind of youth who believes that death is a rumor that happens to other people, until the moment it doesn't. Euryalus' mother appears before they depart, a figure of civilian tenderness dragged into the military world's harsh geometry. Her sorrow is not theatrical. It is the plain human fear of a parent who has already lost a homeland and cannot bear to lose her child as well. Nisus promises to protect Euryalus. The promise is both completely sincere and tragically impossible, because no man can guarantee another man's life in a world where fate and chance move like hidden knives. Virgil uses the mother not merely for pathos, but to anchor the entire episode in the reality of displaced people. The Trojans are refugees as much as warriors. Their women and elders live inside a precarious camp that could be burned at any moment. The mother's grief gives the story its domestic heartbeat, the reminder that even epic wars are fought at the edge of family fires. They slip into the darkness. The night raid begins with terrible success. The Rutulians sleep heavily, dulled by wine and the confidence of men who believe tomorrow is already decided. Nisus and Euryalus move like shadows with intentions. They kill men in their sleep, swift, efficient. The poem describes the bloodshed with a cold beauty that makes the reader uneasy. And in that unease, Virgil touches an ancient question. Is there honor in killing sleeping men? The epic tradition does not demand modern moral clarity. It is more interested in the psychological truth that violence can be intoxicating even for heroes who began with a clear and righteous purpose. The raid becomes a spree. The line between necessity and excess begins to blur. Euryalus is drawn toward spoils. He takes a shining helmet, rich armored trophies that catch the torchlight like captured stars. The choice feels small in the moment. The epic knows how small choices become the hinges of catastrophe. The glittering prize will betray him. It is too simple to call this greed. It is more like youthful hunger for recognition, the desire to return with evidence of bravery that cannot be denied or debated. The urge to make the invisible visible, to be seen. As they attempt to withdraw, the enemy's watch stirs. A patrol catches the glint of that stolen helmet in the dark. The knight that served as their cloak becomes an accusing eye. The chase is sudden, panicked. Nisus is swift, a runner shaped by practice and instinct. Euryalus is strong but less experienced in the brutal mathematics of escape. Fear changes the body. The forest becomes a maze of branches and shadows. The hunters close in. Euryalus is captured. The scene is agonizing because Virgil lets the reader feel the mismatch between the boy's courage and the world's complete indifference to it. He is not taken because he failed. He is taken because the odds turned, and war has never offered fairness as a consolation prize. Nisus hears the shout and stops. This is the moment where friendship becomes fate. He could continue alone, reach Aeneas, complete the mission, save the camp. The epic does not pretend the choice is simple, but you can feel the weight of what it means. The values of duty and the values of love are placed on opposite ends of the same scale, and Nisus chooses love. He circles back into danger. He tries to rescue Euryalus with desperate fury, killing, shouting, pleading, in some tellings offering his own life in exchange. The scene is chaotic and violent, and the more fiercely Nisus fights, the more inevitable the ending becomes, because the epic tradition treats such absolute loyalty as beautiful and doomed. A spear finds Euryalus. The young warrior falls. Nisus's grief turns immediate and feral. He throws himself into the enemy ranks and dies as well, not as a calculated sacrifice, but as a man who simply cannot imagine continuing to breathe after watching the death of the person who gave his life meaning in the bleak, long nights of the camp. The bodies are brought back to the Trojans. The mourning is the kind of collective sorrow a displaced people cannot afford and cannot prevent. Virgil's voice in this moment is tender and unwavering. He treats their names as worthy of enduring memory, and later Roman readers would have recognized exactly what that choice meant. The Aeneid is a poem about duty to the future, about individual sacrifice for the survival of the collective. Yet in Nisus and Euryalus, Virgil offers a different shade of virtue, the devotion to a friend that becomes its own form of sacred obligation. Private love elevated to the level of a founding principle. The episode is often read as one of the most emotionally intimate in the entire epic, and the reason is simple. Virgil allows these two men to love each other with an intensity that stands out clearly against all the political and divine machinery surrounding them. Their raid is brave and also destructive. Their mission is arguably unfinished in strategic terms. The indulgence in slaughter and the impulse towards stolen glory exposed the danger of youthful ardor untempered by discipline. Virgil seems to understand that heroism can be flawed and still be worthy of mourning. This nuance is crucial to the Aeneid's deeper argument about what it means to build a nation. Founding myths cannot be made solely of victories and saints. They must also contain beautiful mistakes, the blood price of impulsive courage, because that is what makes the future feel earned rather than simply given. There is also a shadow that falls across this episode from older tradition. The friendship of Achilles and Patroclus stands behind many later tales of martial devotion. The bond of Orestes and Pylades in tragedy offers another model of loyal companionship. Virgil writes within that tradition, but he gives Nisus and Euryalus a specifically Roman framing. Their story is not set in the heroic age of Greece. It is set in the transitional age that will give birth to Roman identity. Their deaths become part of the moral ancestry of Rome, a poetic claim that the virtues of loyalty and the willingness to die for the person beside you are woven into the nation's mythic bloodstream. And yet the poem refuses to claim that such virtues guarantee a happy outcome. Love does not always save those who feel it most fiercely. That truth, unsentimental, unsparing, and somehow still tender, is what makes this episode survive. As the war continues after their deaths, the Trojan camp grows quieter in some corners and more determined in others. The fortress of stakes and earthworks feels less like a temporary refuge and more like the fragile shell of a people learning what it means to fight for a home that exists mostly as a promise. The men who knew Nisus and Euryalus will remember them not only as warriors, but as proof that even in the bleak calculus of war, there are bonds worth more than survival. Some soldiers will look toward the dark beyond the walls and remember the glint of a stolen helmet, the sudden shout, the terrible speed with which a bold plan can collapse into mourning. Others will hold the memory like a talisman. The Rutulian camp across the plain may celebrate their small victory, unaware that they have killed two men whose names will last far longer than their own. The stars above remain cold and beautifully indifferent, as if they too are waiting to see what kind of world will be built from the sacrifices of the nameless and the remembered alike. Odysseus and the Cyclops. The road home from Troy was never going to be a straight line for a man like Odysseus. Some heroes are remembered for the single bright moment when they stand in the center of a battlefield and refuse to fall. Odysseus is remembered for something harder and stranger: endurance, the mind that keeps turning when the body wants to sink, the stubborn human talent for improvising survival out of fear and hunger and a little bit of spite. When the great city finally burned and the Greeks scattered to the sea, the war did not release him. It had spent a decade reshaping him, feeding him danger and disappointment, teaching him that even the gods are unpredictable partners. He sailed with men who had learned to trust his tricks, but who longed for the simple peace of Ithaca, for wives and children and familiar hills, and the smell of home cooking instead of smoke from enemy walls. The ships moved across waters that were both real and enchanted. In the epic imagination, the Mediterranean is not only geography, it is fate in liquid form. Each island is a test. Each harbor is a question. Each shoreline might offer rescue or ruin, and the difference can be as thin as a wise decision made one moment too late. The land of the Cyclopes arrives in the story like a piece of the world that forgot to learn the rules of humanity. Homer describes them as a people without assemblies, without law courts, without the shared customs that make villages into societies. Each family answers only to its own strength. Their fields are fertile without effort. Their flocks are rich without shepherding skill. In the Greek imagination, civilization is not just walls and temples. It is the discipline of work, the agreements of community, the delicate ritual of hospitality. To live well without law or labor is not a blessing. It is a warning. The Cyclopes are not merely physically monstrous. They are culturally monstrous. They represent a life where strength is allowed to become its own justification, a world without accountability. For Odysseus, who is as much a politician and tactician as he is a warrior, that kind of world is a threat to everything he believes makes life worth returning to. When his ships approach the Cyclopean coast, his men see lush land and shelter and the promise of food. The temptation is almost ordinary. Sailors in the Bronze Age would have understood this hunger at a cellular level. Sea travel was dangerous, slow, dependent on weather and luck. To find an island rich with grazing animals and fresh water was to find something that looked like grace. Odysseus sends scouts, then goes himself, carrying gifts meant for a host. This detail matters. The epic is built on the code of Xenia, the sacred guest friendship protected by Zeus himself. A stranger arrives. A host offers food, shelter, and respect. The guest offers gratitude and goodwill. This was not mere courtesy. It was a survival system in a world where the road and the sea were full of uncertainty. Break this code and you invite divine anger and social collapse. Odysseus enters the cave of Polyphemus expecting that even a strange and enormous people will honor at least the basic outline of hospitality. His mistake is not naivety. It is faith in the idea that humanity, even in its most rugged corners, still recognizes the sacred threshold between guest and host. The cave is described with the vivid practical detail of a working herdsman's home, enlarged to mythic scale. Pens for sheep and goats, racks of cheese, bowls of milk. Odysseus's men want to take what they can and leave. It is a sensible instinct, exactly the kind that might actually save lives. But Odysseus wants to meet the owner. He is curious. He is proud. He believes his words can shape outcomes as surely as his sword. Then the owner returns, and the story tilts into horror with the controlled confidence of a poet who knows precisely how to tighten the air in a listener's lungs. Polyphemus is vast, not refined, not clever. He is a shepherd giant of earthiness and appetite, and when he rolls a stone across the entrance of the cave, the sound of it is the sound of a tomb door closing. When Odysseus introduces himself and invokes the laws of hospitality, Polyphemus responds with contempt. He does not fear Zeus. He does not acknowledge the rules of men. He answers with the logic of a world without communal law. Then he grabs 2 of the Greeks and eats them. The act is presented without ornament. It is meant to shock because it violates every expectation of civilized conduct. The host consuming the guest, the home becoming a slaughterhouse. The sacred code turned into a joke told with teeth. A simpler hero would have exploded here, but Odysseus is not built that way. He is trapped and afraid, and his mind goes immediately to problem-solving the way a wounded animal goes to instinct. He looks at the stone blocking the entrance and understands instantly. Killing Polyphemus outright would accomplish nothing, because no man in his company could move that barrier. So he pauses the revenge that every warrior impulse demands, and begins to plan a solution that is more delicate and more dangerous. He has wine with him, a strong vintage taken earlier in the voyage. He offers it to Polyphemus in a gesture that looks like hospitality, but is in truth a trap laid with polite hands. The Cyclops drinks greedily, astonished by its strength. The great giant is being undone not by a stronger opponent, but by his own indulgence. When Polyphemus asks Odysseus his name, the answer is the most famous lie in ancient literature. Nobody. The choice is not random. In Greek storytelling, names carry identity and fate. To deny your name is to step briefly outside the net of consequence, to dissolve into no one, and therefore to become someone the story cannot easily reach. When Polyphemus collapses into drunken sleep, Odysseus and his men act with swift, controlled terror. They have prepared a stake from an olive tree, hardened in the fire, sharpened to a brutal point. They drive it into the Cyclops' single eye, twisting it with the urgency of men who know that hesitation is death. The scream that follows is the sound of a mythic world splitting open. Polyphemus calls to his neighbors, and the beauty of Odysseus's false name becomes clear. The other Cyclopes ask who is hurting him. He answers that nobody is killing him. The logic of language traps him perfectly. The neighbors leave, assuming divine illness or private madness. A creature who rejected law is now undone by the law of words. A monster who lived alone is abandoned by his own kind when he finally needs communal aid. But the story is not finished with danger. Blinding the Cyclops is only the middle chapter of survival. Polyphemus, now blind, gropes toward the entrance each morning to let his flock out, placing his hands over the backs of the animals to ensure no human slips past. Odysseus responds with one of his most astonishing acts of escape. He ties his men beneath the bellies of the sheep, using the Cyclops' own wealth as the vehicle of liberation. Great animals shuffle out into daylight carrying fragile human lives, hidden beneath wool and muscle. Polyphemus speaks to his favorite ram in some versions, his voice thick with grief, wondering why the animal is last to leave, unaware that Odysseus himself clings beneath it. Even here, the poem allows a note of pity for the monster. He is cruel. He is also a shepherd who genuinely loves his flock. The myth allows this complexity because fear is more powerful when it is attached to something almost human. When the Greeks reach their ship and push out to sea, the moment feels like a release of breath held since the cave. Then Odysseus ruins it. He cannot resist the final word. As they sail away, he shouts his real name to Polyphemus, his actual name, his father's name, his island's name. After being reduced to prey in a dark cave, after watching men die in the most humiliating way imaginable, he needs the world to know that it was Odysseus of Ithaca who did this. The need for kleos, for fame that outlives the body, rises in him like a fever. In heroic culture, such a declaration is nearly reflexive, but this is precisely why the poet punishes it. Polyphemus is the son of Poseidon. When his identity is confirmed, he calls upon his father with a prayer that is more curse than plea. He asks that Odysseus should never reach home, or if he must, that he should arrive alone, broken, late, to find trouble waiting. Poseidon hears. The sea that had been a road becomes a judge. The curse stretches across the rest of the epic like a long shadow cast by a single reckless moment. Intelligence can save you, but pride can reopen the trap you just escaped. Survival is not only about defeating external threats. It is also about mastering the appetite within yourself, for recognition, revenge, and the sweet, dangerous thrill of being known. The Cyclops episode also sits within a larger web of ancient thought about the boundaries of humanity. Without shared institutions, without councils and laws, a community becomes a set of isolated caves. The episode is a parable about the value of civilization, told through the language of horror. The cave is both home and prison. The shepherd is both provider and predator. The hero is both brilliant and flawed. Some scholars have suggested possible real-world inspirations for the Cyclops myth, including the discovery of fossilized skulls of prehistoric elephants in the Mediterranean, particularly in places like Sicily, where the large central nasal cavity might be mistaken for a single enormous eye socket. This idea cannot be proven as the origin, but it offers a vivid reminder that ancient mythmaking grew at the intersection of imagination and physical evidence. A strange skull found on a coastline could become a giant. A dangerous shore could become a monster's territory. The Greeks who traveled westward during periods of colonization and trade would have encountered landscapes that felt profoundly different from the familiar Aegean world. Stories of wild, lawless inhabitants could fuse easily with older narrative patterns about divine offspring and ancient terrors. The Cyclops stands at the crossroads of poetic invention, cultural anxiety, and possibly even paleontological wonder. A perfect example of how myth can be both fantasy and a distorted mirror of human experience. By the time Odysseus sails away from the Cyclopean shore, he has won a victory that feels like a legend in miniature, and created a disaster that will shape the rest of his life. His men might cheer briefly, then fall silent as the first storms sent by Poseidon begin to gather. The sea darkens. The wind changes its voice. The horizon seems to recede, as if the world itself is punishing confidence. In the quiet hours of night aboard the ship, with oars resting and stars watching from a distance too cold to comfort, Odysseus might feel the precise weight of what he has done. Not the blinding of the monster, that was necessity, but the revelation of his name, that was hunger. The Odyssey is a poem that understands hunger in all its forms. Hunger for food, for safety, for home, for recognition. And it suggests that the last of these can be the most dangerous, because it disguises itself as dignity while quietly sabotaging everything you have fought to build. The ship continues into darkness. Behind them, the blinded shepherd still sits on his shore, not dead, changed forever. A living reminder that even monsters can be wounded in ways that demand a divine response. Ahead, scattered islands and treacherous waters and doors not yet opened. Someone tends a small lamp with cupped hands, sheltering the flame from the wind. It glows on tired faces. The smell of salt and wood and old fear mingles in the night air. For a moment, the victory in the cave is both a lifeline and a warning. A story within the story. Proof that cleverness can pry open the jaws of fate, and proof that one careless boast can invite those jaws to close again. The sea is wide, the night is long, and Odysseus, the man of many turns, still has a very long way to go. That's all for tonight, from Epic Mythology. 7 stories, 7 chambers, and somewhere inside each of them, the same quiet question the ancient world kept asking. What does it cost to be human in a world governed by forces larger than you? If this meant something to you, please like, subscribe, leave a comment. Tell us which of these 7 stayed with you. Tell us which one you'll still be thinking about tomorrow. Until next time, take care of yourselves and each other, and I'll see you in the next story.